everyone. Thanks so kindly for joining us. Welcome to Green Apple Books in the Park. Hi, my name is Cart Johnson. I'm the event coordinator for Green Apple, and tonight I'm very excited to welcome Osprey Orielle Lake to celebrate her book, The Story is in Our Bones, How Worldviews and Climate Justice Can Remake a World in Crisis. Let's give a hand for her. And she is joined tonight by author Jeremy Lent. Let's give a hand for Jeremy as well. We are here tonight in San Francisco. We're broadcasting from San Francisco to all you online people. We appreciate you joining us both in person and online. We are on unceded Remake land, and we hope that you join us in our pledge to turn land acknowledgement into action by donating either your time or monetary means to an Indigenous organization each time you hear a land acknowledgement. For your convenience, we have a QR code at the back desk that will direct you to the Remake Land Trust website, where you can find details on this project of rematriation and how you can contribute to it. I have very brief business before we get to the heart of the evening. Now is a good time to silence your cell phones if you have not already. Always appreciate it. I would say picture taking is encouraged. Is that okay? Excellent. Please do check out our full event calendar online at greenapplebooks.com. We have a really great season coming your way, including the event that you are currently attending. The restroom is behind me. It is available after the event and not during the event for obvious reasons. If you need to know how to get there, I am happy to tell you. We have books by both of our authors available at the front register. You can find them there. And if you've been here before, you've certainly heard me say that when you buy books from us, not only do you support us as an independent bookstore, you support the authors who put so much work into making these books, and then you get to have a book, and they'll probably sign them afterward, which might be the best part. So if you are able to, we always appreciate it. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce the two authors who are joining us. First, Jeremy Lent is an author and speaker whose work investigates the underlying causes of our civilization's existential crisis and explores pathways toward a life-affirming future. He holds a BA in English Literature from Cambridge and an MBA from the University of Chicago and was a former internet company CEO. He is author of the award-winning book, The Patterning Instinct, A Cultural History of Humanity's Search for Meaning, as well as The Web of Meaning, Integrating Science and Traditional Wisdom to Find Our Place in the Universe. He's the founder of the Deep Transformation Network and the nonprofit Biology Institute, dedicated to fostering an integrated worldview that could enable humanity to thrive sustainably on the Earth. He writes topical articles exploring the deeper patterns of political and cultural developments at Patterns of Meaning. Please give one more hand for Jeremy Lent. And last but most certainly not least, Osprey Orielle Lake is founder and executive director of the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network, or WeCan, and sits on the executive committee of the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature and on the steering committee for the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. She writes for The Guardian, Common Dreams, The Ecologist, and others, and is author of Uprisings for the Earth. She lives in the San Francisco Bay Area on Coast Miwok lands, and her book, The Story is in Our Bones, is the reason we are here tonight. Let's welcome once again Osprey Orielle Lake.
Okay, well, hi everyone, and hey Osprey. It's really a pleasure to spend some time talking with you about your book and about all that came through you to actually write the book is what I find so fascinating. And Osprey and I actually have known each other for a number of years. I really got to know you at the Paris climate conference way back in 2015, the one that led to that Paris Agreement. And even then I was amazed at just the amount of energy and focused leadership you were given to Indigenous people and other voices that were not being heard there, actually at the conventional, at the sort of main conference itself. And and of course, that was all part of the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network, which, for anyone who hasn't caught that, the acronym from that is We Can, which is what I love so much. And perhaps you could start off just by talking a little bit about what We Can does, and you know, and how you've been like working with them to really make an impact on what's going on in the world right now.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. It's such a pleasure to have this time with you.
Yeah.
As Jeremy said, we've been friends for some time and colleagues, and thank you all for coming. The Women's Earth and Climate Action Network, or WECAN, was really founded some years ago in 2009 when the Obama administration first came into office. And a lot of us thought, wow, we're going to really have a change around what's going to happen with the climate crisis when he went to the UN annual climate conference in Copenhagen. I was in Copenhagen that year. And, you know, in short, we didn't really see the results that we thought we were going to have, not just because of Obama, but world governments and the whole systems that we're operating in now. And it was at that point that I really stopped everything that I was doing and said, I really need to address the climate crisis because it is existential and it affects the entire web of life and all current and future generations. And a lot of the research that I did brought me to realize that one of the untold stories and undervalued aspects of solutions around the climate crisis was, in fact, women's leadership. And I'll just give one stat to give an example so people have an understanding of this, but I was asked a little while ago to do a presentation for the Scenarios Forum, which is a group of researchers who feed information to the IPCC reports, which are what a lot of the science for the UN climate talks are based on. And I found this study that showed that just a 1 unit increase in something called the Women's Political Empowerment Index leads to a 11.51% degree decrease in carbon emissions just by women's role in leadership, social engagement, efforts in politics. You get this huge result. And I could go on and on from the highest levels of government to grassroots women and their efforts around food and forests and water protection, that there's this enormous role that women play around mitigating the climate crisis. And so that's when I formed We Can, and we do everything from forest protection to reforestation to advocacy at the climate talks to doing a lot of work with getting banks to transfer their funds to renewable energy and food sovereignty. So there's a wide range of programs, but the main emphasis is, you know, this direct work with how we can change the trajectory that we're in.
Yeah, which is what we need so desperately to do right now. And yeah, thanks for that, Osprey. And something that I truly enjoyed in the book, which I feel is very special in what you're able to do there, is to kind of weave these different dimensions of how we make sense of basically this crisis we're in right now. So one sort of domain, if you will, was all around your actual activism, and the book is filled with on-the-ground examples of things I felt I was right there with you, and it's like so immediate that you were describing. And then you sort of weave that into a much, much deeper kind of historical analysis of how we got to this place in the first place. And so one way is like the deep history, and then there's also a more conceptual underpinning, like what are the worldviews, what's the underlying thinking that led to that. And one thing I'm curious about, and I really want to go into some of those themes in more detail with you now. But in terms of your own life, was it always kind of obvious to you as you got involved in engaging with the world that the frontline stuff, the stuff on the ground, was so intimately tied with the deep underlying systemic issues, or did that sort of dawn on you at some point? And how did you come to realize that deep interconnection?
I love that question. So, yeah, I wrote the book having done a lot of activism work and advocacy work. And the book really is an exploration of going upstream. so that we can look at the root causes of how we got into what a lot of scholars are calling a polycrisis right now, whether it's racial injustice or indigenous rights violations, or what we're seeing with the climate crisis or environmental degradation, or the level that we're seeing misogyny. And all of these things are very interconnected, as you were saying, Jeremy. And so the book is really a look at how do we step back and realize the root causes of these interlocking systems of oppression so that we can understand them and then transform them. Because it's really hard to change something if you don't know what you're naming and what is causing the ills of society, if you will. And so for me, the issues of our political actions or activism is directly linked to what you were asking about, which is addressing these systems of oppressions at a deep root level. And so at the work at We Can, but certainly we're not alone, I think the question is like, how do we intervene in the current structures and the current systems, whether it's advocating at the UN climate talks or fighting a fossil fuel project or trying to protect a forest? How are we intervening with the deepest part of our spirit and our knowledge systems to transform them? Because we could forever run around stopping this or that bad project or, trying to improve different conditions on the ground. And that is key. I mean, that's what I do every single day, is work with frontline communities and take action. But I'm well aware, as you're sort of getting at, that if we don't address the root causes and deal with systemic change, then those systems will keep perpetuating themselves. And so for me, these worlds are married. And the crux of it is like, how do we express our action? How do we express these activities? What is the message behind, this or that campaign, so that we can intervene and not only stop a bad project or start something beautiful, but also how do we change the narrative so that we're building the world that we know is possible?
Yeah, love that. And really, when you're saying about sort of changing the message, so much of that has to do with a theme that you start the book out with, which is one that intersects with a lot of what I write about, which is essentially like the worldview that people hold. And I think you and I both share the sense that a worldview is so important because it's almost like the lens, right, by which we see everything. And one of the important things about looking at a worldview is most people aren't even aware that they have a worldview, right? In the same way that you have a lens you look out through your eye, you don't realize that there is a lens, but it changes how you see things. And maybe one thing, a great way to begin, maybe going deeper, is if you could summarize in your mind what you see as the key elements of this dominant worldview that is leading us to this destructive path. And maybe we can look then at some of those some of those elements themselves, and then we can turn to what might be a different kind of worldview that's essentially the story in our bones, to not make too much fine a point about it. Right?
And I also just want to really acknowledge Jeremy, who's written some beautiful books, The Web of Meaning, and just thank you, because Jeremy has a very deep analysis, as you can hear, and has done a lot of wonderful thinking on these issues. So it's just really fun to have this conversation with you and also to look into his work. So going back to your question, I think it's really key that we do look at our worldview. And when I was saying upstream earlier, that's what I was really referring to is if we look at root causes, what I'm talking about specifically is the roots of capitalism, the roots of colonization and patriarchy and racism. And there's others, but that's plenty to work with right there. There's these key systems of oppression that we're facing right now that are infused into our politics, our culture, our societies, our global circumstance right now. And so how do we look at what are these worldviews that led to these systems of oppression? And one of the things that I'm addressing in my book and have studied a lot is this idea of, let's pull out a few of them, this idea of dominion over nature, this concept in modern society that humans have dominion over nature. The idea of white supremacy, that white people have dominion over indigenous black and brown peoples and cultures and bodies. These are two key components of what I'm addressing in the book. And how do we address colonization that has resulted from these worldviews and this idea of really a hierarchical view of society. And again, I spent a lot of time in the book writing about it, so it's sort of hard to put it into sound bites, but just in essence, if we think about the primary Abrahamic world religions as an example, that have really birthed this idea of this one male God and a monotheistic system, and how that intervened all over the world, really, with this idea of an animate living cosmology where the rivers are alive, the trees are alive, the forest is alive, the stones have their own personality and are beings and sentient beings and alive. And this relationship that all of us in our ancestry at some point had with nature, that we are part and particle of nature. And that huge and I think very detrimental intervention in the human experience of being part of the web of life, with this idea of this one male dominant God who's now separate from the flowers and the bees and the ocean and the rivers, and is no longer part of this earthly realm. And now we are experience ourselves, most of us, not everyone, but the dominant culture, as separate from our living systems of life, the sacred systems of life, the web of life. And now we, in our modern society, most frequently experience ourselves as orphans, really, orphans from the natural world, separate from. And that worldview alone has been so detrimental, because as soon as we're separate from nature, the ideas of extractivism, this extractive economy that we have, where we can just take endlessly from the earth and never reciprocate, that we are here to have dominion over the land and use the land and to turn nature into a commodity. All of these things are very connected to this worldview of dominion over nature. And again, we could talk about this idea of white supremacy, that is so connected to colonization, and that there are certain people who are more important than other people and have the right to go into lands and territories and to colonize them and to create genocides and to create the extermination of others and take over the land because of some divine right that is just a belief system and a worldview, is so incredibly dangerous, as we're seeing today. And so these deep worldviews need to be discussed and brought to the surface and unpacked and dismantled and transformed and composted into something else.
Yeah. And that's something that I feel your book does so well. It really looks deeply at each of those things you're talking about, and sort of things like, so something that is not obvious to people unless they've started to look at it is this very notion that the concept itself of whiteness just began right around the same time as the beginning of colonialism, and that it's no coincidence that was the birth of capitalism, that colonialism, capitalism, that extractive way of thinking all came around right around the time of the scientific revolution, which was almost like came from that notion of what you were just describing, of rather than seeing the earth as animate and alive, as more like a mechanical thing to be sort of taken apart. But what I find so curious is, so all of that stuff was those last maybe 500 years, and then there's the patriarchy, which goes so much deeper, right? Because it goes all the way back. So many early civilizations all around the world were so patriarchal. And that's something that's so widespread. And I'm just kind of curious as to how we can look at really unpacking that it's so deep in so many cultures, that patriarchy. How do we recognize it and move beyond it? And you do a great job in that book of showing how destructive it is, not just of women, but men also get like tyrannized by the expectations coming around from patriarchal thinking. So.
Yeah, thank you for that. So yes, I think that, I do talk in the book about some of the origins of patriarchy, and so there's an analysis there, and of course scholars have been arguing and as they should, discussing what is the origin of patriarchy, where did this come from, why did it happen, and I do go into that in the book because there's differing views on that. But in essence, we have patriarchy, no matter how we want to slice it and dice it. We're in the throes of patriarchal societies worldwide. And I think one of the things that we lost in that process of moving to these systems of patriarchy is the loss of the sense of the goddess and the feminine principle, and the huge impact of that imbalance in our societies. And I think it's also very connected to the fact that once we say that there is a hierarchy and men are above women, although I don't like binaries, I think that we need to really include gender diverse peoples, but just in a simplified term of the patriarchy of seeing men above women. But as soon as we establish that, it really opens the door for many other forms of this ideology of hierarchy. So then we can have white people being more important than indigenous, black or brown people, or humans above nature. So anytime we start singling out any part of the ecosystem as more important than the other, we instantly are out of balance with the natural laws of the earth. And so the patriarchy has been going on for a very long time, and I think we're in the throes of the worst aspects of it right now. And so we need to take this very seriously, and it is so key to the violence that we're seeing around the world. One way of saying it is, the violence against the earth begets violence against women, and the idea of the feminine, the earth being the mother goddess. So we see the casting down of the mother goddess in ancient times and the rise of the male patriarchy. We're also seeing the narrative being born of the separation from nature. And all of those things are completely interconnected, of separating ourselves from the earth, separating ourselves from the mother earth, separating ourselves from the living goddess that is in the rivers, in the mountains, in the sky, in our animate cosmology. And how do we now reclaim those stories, I think, is the big question, because we need this balance to return. And as you mentioned, for me, it's not about putting men down. It's about lifting women up and creating balance, and how the patriarchy has equally harmed women and men, because also we talk about, the male god figure, but we have to remember the male god figure we have is not the one that our ancestors that were pre-patriarchal or pre-colonized experienced.
Right.
We have the sacred male god who has also been cast down. And so the version of the male god we have is not the one that is balanced, the sacred masculine.
Yeah.
And so we've really lost both, and they both have to be revived, and those stories have to be regenerated and retold in our current cultural and ecological contexts. Because it's not about going to the past, it's about learning from the past and retrieving those ancestral roots, but we need to regenerate them and regrow them in our current context, and that's sort of one of the tasks of our time.
Yeah. So right, and I love how you connect the patriarchy with hierarchy, and that, of course, is what we're living in that world right now. But in contrast to that, you write, obviously, a major theme of the book is how in indigenous cultures, there's a very different way in which people relate to each other, to gender, and also to the earth. And the foreword of the book, of course, is written by the Ponca Nation leader, Casey Kamparanek, who I think she writes about how you are her adopted niece, I think she said at one point. So I'm curious, one on a personal basis, maybe you can begin with this first, and then we can go into the sort of deeper layers. How you and your activist work got to be so deeply engaged with indigenous peoples here and all around the world, and then what can we learn from how they see the world and how they organize to actually apply that, throughout.
Yes, I think one of the important things to start with is that 80%, so that's a major factor that all of us should sit up in our chairs and recognize that 80% of biodiversity is in the hands and lands of indigenous people. And that's, not surprising given their relationship with the land and their understanding of how to live in harmony with the world and the earth and the natural laws. And so I'm a really big advocate of indigenous rights and indigenous sovereignty and sitting at the feet of indigenous people and really learning from them and really respecting their rights and their campaigns and their calls for decolonization, their calls for land back. I think it's a political activity, but it is also one, important just on its own merit out of respect for indigenous peoples who have been discriminated against and violated for thousands of years due to colonization, but also to recognize it's important to all of our survival, to understand the knowledge systems, the traditional ecological knowledge of indigenous peoples, the knowledge that they offer, and the incredible resistance efforts that they have put out to protect water and land and forests for decade after decade after decade in incredibly difficult situations, deadly situations, putting their lives on the line. And so I think that there's, been a lot of progress in some ways around understanding indigenous rights, indigenous knowledge, indigenous peoples in the last decade. Since, Standing Rock certainly is a big example of putting center stage the struggles of indigenous peoples and their knowledge system that was, a cry that went out throughout the world, Mini Wichoni. Water is life. Water is life. That went out all over the world. Mini Wichoni. So powerful for all of us to remember that water is life.
Yeah.
And at the same time, so much more needs to happen. I mean, as we speak, the communities that we work with are fighting for their lives, fighting to protect the Amazon rainforest, protecting waterways all over the world. And so I think we need to understand this deep relationship with indigenous peoples and the relationship with the land and their teachings about the fact that we do live in an animate cosmology and how can we all learn from that. I think it's a combination of really learning from indigenous peoples wherever we live. I'm really glad we opened up with a land acknowledgement for where we are now on indigenous territories, and to, a beginning step to really recognize for most of us, not everybody, but most of us live on stolen lands. And this is where we live. And so what do we do now? I think one of the first steps is to really learn about the indigenous peoples wherever we live, and to learn about their calls to action, to learn about their campaigns, to learn about what they are wanting to see on their lands, and how do we respond to that as part of our activism and as part of our daily life in anything that we do. I think it's really essential that we put front and center indigenous peoples as a solution. We always say indigenous peoples are a solution to the poly crisis. Indigenous peoples' knowledge is a solution to the climate crisis, in the same way that women's rights and women's knowledge and leadership is essential to the climate crisis. These are leaders that we need to listen to. And I would also add a racial lens, Black and brown sisters, anywhere we see some of the most deep analysis of our struggles, but also the solutions. Yeah. And so I think this is where we need to really center our attention.
Great. Yeah. And one of the ways that you are involved in of taking that deep indigenous knowing of the relation with the land and looking at Mother Nature as an intrinsic value is with actually the Global Alliance for rights of nature, and that's a global organization that's really trying to change some of the mainstream thinking about how to view the human relationship with nature. Maybe you could talk a little bit. You're on the I think executive committee of GARN is the acronym for that. And maybe you could talk a little bit about their work and what they're doing and how you're connecting what We Can is doing with GARN also.
Yeah, so the Global Alliance for Rights of Nature, We Can is on the, as you mentioned, on the executive committee. I've been on the executive committee for, I think, close to a decade now. And it's really exciting work because rights of nature, in essence, and there's a whole chapter on it in the book, and is this idea that not only do we need to have the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Humans, which we do, but equally we need the Universal Declaration on the rights of nature or on the rights of Mother Earth, and get Mother Earth center stage into the conversation. And right now, all over the world, legally, we see nature not being represented in our courts of law as its own entity, because nature is viewed as property. Mm-hmm. And so nature is in this current system of law of environmental regulatory systems, and what we see, because nature is viewed as property, we have the commodification and financialization of nature, and nature is really in the marketplace. Mm-hmm. And what rights of nature does is it really turns these systems upside down legally and says, no, we don't want our rivers and forests and the mountains and our minerals in the marketplace. Mm-hmm. Nature has the right to thrive and live and have a future and be respected on its own terms. And so this is a huge movement that's been growing for a long time. And in 2008, Ecuador became the first country in the world to put rights of nature in their constitution. Mm-hmm. And since then, there's been cases of rivers being protected in Ecuador based on rights of nature, that the river had the right to thrive and be healthy. There's been at least 36 cases in the United States, some protecting local communities from fracking, creating local ordinances to use rights of nature in their communities and really asserting rights of nature in law. In Colombia, there was a youth group that put together a rights of nature case to protect the Amazon forest in Colombia. And one thing that really moved me is I was invited on a fact-finding mission, if you will, to New Zealand with Movement Rights, really close partners of ours. Right. And we went to New Zealand to be with the Maori people, because one of the sort of faces of rights of nature is also having personhood, nature having personhood. Mm-hmm. And there, the Maori people had fought for over 100 years to protect the Wanganui River, which they view as their living ancestor. And again, going back to this idea of the animate living earth as our relative. Mm-hmm. And so they fought and won not very long ago with the New Zealand government to have one representative from the government and one representative from the tribe to be custodians and stewards of the Wanganui River as an ancestor, as having legal personhood. So you can't harm the river just as you wouldn't harm a human. So it's a really amazing breakthrough in our legal structures about how to view nature and how we can transform our legal systems to really see ourselves part and particle of the web of life and bring nature into the proper throne that nature should be. And just as a quick story that this conversation reminded me of, when I was in New Zealand and was invited by some of the Maori elders to go to the Wanganui River. There's a beautiful woman who brought myself there, and actually Casey Camp Hornick, who you mentioned earlier. And she brought us to the river and a really special place there, and sang a beautiful song that just, opened our hearts and made us cry. And when we were sitting there, she took my hand and she said, "We have a saying here, I am the river and the river is me. I am the river and the river is me." and that deep connection, like not metaphorically, but like our bodies as humans are mainly water. And here is this flowing river and is literally our ancestor. And how can we connect with that in that moment? I could just feel that embodied sense of being connected to the land and saying, I am the river and the river is me. And how this transforms our worldview. And going back to some of your questions, Jeremy, within that context, how does that affect our politics? How does that affect our decision making when we come from a place where we understand ourselves in relationship to a living cosmology, and that the world around us is our relatives and we're just one part of this great ecosystem of life? And that is really what I'm trying to get at, is how do we get from where we are now to this respect and reciprocal relationship and relationship with the natural world.
Yeah, God, that I love the way you describe that. And I'd say something about the book to enjoy is there are so many different stories that Osprey writes about, just like that. I felt as reading it that I was there with you, kind of experiencing it and feeling it. And to your point, it goes from, and that's why I love the title, goes from our bones itself to the way we talk and think. So then when we're engaging in some activism stuff, we're not just sort of there with our heads out there, but we're feeling it all the way through from what you're experiencing. And then just want to add one more really exciting development. I know that you are also part of that. I think at the executive committee also, and this is this idea of a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. What an exciting idea. Perhaps you can just tell everyone about what that's about and what that's trying to do, and again, what your role has been on that.
Yeah, I think it's another exciting moment in our global climate justice movements. There's something called the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, and I sit on the steering committee. There's a wonderful woman named Zipporah Berman who is the chair of it. And basically, we started out actually talking about the Paris Climate Agreement, where Jeremy and I were in Paris for that gathering of all the countries. And it's a really important agreement. The Paris Climate Agreement is very substantial in that all countries agreed to engage and have a legally binding agreement to stop the climate crisis, in essence, and address that as a global community of countries. And it was valuable in the sense that it gave us the 1.5 degree guardrail, which is very important, and we use that a lot in our advocacy. There's a lot of flaws in the agreement as well. And one of the biggest shortcomings is that it really doesn't deal with the supply end, meaning gas, oil, and coal, and the source of the climate crisis, which is putting more carbon emissions in the atmosphere. And it doesn't address that. And I don't want to get into the politics of that. And I saw the 5-minute sign come up. So I'm not going to go into all of that. But what's really exciting about the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, it is a mechanism that can be a parallel or component to the Paris Climate Agreement, and it allows for governments to specifically meet around how do we actually specifically phase out fossil fuel and end the era of fossil fuels. And it's very exciting. And just to give an example, there are now 12, if not more, but I know for sure 12 countries that have endorsed this treaty, so that there's a way for them to meet and specifically talk about fossil fuels and how we're going to transition off of them. And when I was in Dubai in December during the UN climate talks, COP28, one of the things that really moved me is that the country of Colombia endorsed the treaty, the fossil fuel treaty, when we were there. And it's really significant because Colombia is a fossil fuel producing country, and for them to step forward was really a big deal. So I'm very hopeful about that. And, there's lots more work to be done on it, but it's excellent to have a mechanism, an idea, and an initiative that says we can get off of fossil fuels, and here's a methodology about how we can do it.
Yeah, wow. So great. Yeah, thanks for that. And so let me just ask you one final question, and then I want to turn over to you and see if any of you want to ask questions of Osprey. But like through this whole time we've been talking, there's been this kind of theme of, on the one hand, how desperately bad things are, and looking at those deep underlying layers that have driven us for hundreds of years towards this crisis. And so many things you've been talking about feel like sparks of hope. And I'm just wondering, it's something I think anybody who essentially just is openly reading the news each day and looking at our situation feels into. How do you personally navigate this kind of these pulls in different directions towards almost like despair, maybe, of seeing what's going on and where we're headed, and then towards some sense of a positive future? How do you feel we can hold those two elements?
Oh, the $1,000,000 question. It's really challenging. I think it's a great question. I mean, I think it's really hard, and I don't think that I am in one place all of the time. Yeah. I think there's different days where, some really tragic things happen that we experience, like we work with frontline women leaders in the Amazon who might be threatened for their land defense. One of them may be harmed or killed. And there's days like that where I can really feel such deep sorrow and despair because it's so wrong and unjust. Seeing what's happening to our sisters and brothers in Palestine right now. It's very, very, very hard to deal with that, and also the hostages, looking at both sides in that way in Israel. Just the incredible trauma that is happening in the world right now is extensive. The ongoing colonization, the ongoing power of wealthy countries, and the lack of care that they exercise is deeply hard on a daily basis. And the fact that we see this endless extractive economy being relentless, and the fact that we know that scientists have told us we must stop extracting fossil fuels, and yet we continue to expand them. Right. So yes, it's very challenging to say, like, how do we stay hopeful in this space? But for me, I do stay hopeful in the sense that I do see rights of nature growing, this fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty growing, these incredible solutions around Indigenous peoples. We have projects around food sovereignty, food security. We're doing this reforestation project in the DR Congo, where, just to give a short example, we've been reforesting this damaged land, and now 9 years into it, it's a women-led project. We've planted so many trees that the rains are coming back. And so nature is also now reseeding and creating natural forests in addition to the trees are growing. I think, wow, in 9 years that happened. And so that brings me a lot of hope. And so I think it's a dance of weaving between really taking in the grief and the horror of the moment, and at the same time realizing that there is so much that we can do as human beings to be life enhancing and generating beautiful actions and be creating the world that we want. And I think we're right at the cusp of, while one world is burning, another world is being birthed that we are all summoning. Everyone here in the audience, I know, is pulling for this new world in every which way that we can, in the ways that we do it, unique to our passions and time and what we have capacity to do. And that's what gives me hope, is I see so many people summoning this world that we want. And it's so creative and so filled with passion. And the young people we work with and the old people we work with, I mean, everybody is rolling up their sleeves. And so it's a tight window, but I think we just need to keep ourselves steady, be in community together, and we're going to see ourselves through. I think things are going to get harder before they get better. But as we get clear about who we are in the earth lineage, what our values are, and we remain in community together, work collectively, I do think we have a chance to make things a lot better than they are now.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that, Osprey. Yeah. And I'd love to turn to you and see if anybody who wants to ask any questions of Osprey yourself.
start banning the production of gasoline cars. And, one thing about limiting extraction, etc., but what can we do about the tremendous amount of products that are made out of petroleum and the demand of society for petroleum products?
Yeah.
Maybe that's a bad question.
Yeah. Well, so for people who are tuning in on the internet, so the question was about what can we do about all the fossil fuel products and burning that is going on? How do we turn that around? Basically, I think is what you're asking. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if we don't require these heating systems, electrical systems, and if we don't use the things that we have in society right now that make our lives great, if we change that view, we should all buy a tent instead. But yeah, it's so hard to change the flow of society. It's depressing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what's really important to note is how many solutions are already out there that are not being implemented. And so for me, it is about also fighting off all of the actors that are interfering with actually solutions that are there. So just as an example, and I'm not an expert on it, but I've been studying a lot about hemp products that can replace plastics. It's very real. And so I really don't think it has a lot to do with the fact that we couldn't move to other safe products and plastics. It's that the companies and the corporations and the financial institutions who are invested in fossil fuels are interfering with forward progress. So this is why I think, at least at Weekend, and everybody has their own strategy, we're like fighting the bad stuff while we're building the good stuff, because a lot of what we're facing is that we live in these very top-down hierarchical structures that we've been talking about this evening. And so let's not forget that a lot of times it's corporations and wealthy countries and financial institutions that are completely based on this extractive economy and a fossil fuel economy that don't want that changed. So when people have these really innovative ideas, they're interfered with or dismissed or taken off the market because they interfere with the business as usual that's going on now. So I think it's up to us to really do a lot of work and advocacy to stop these bad actors. And that is a big part of it right now. So I'm oddly much less concerned about there being the solutions that are healthy and just, and more concerned about allowing the people to do the business of the people as they wish, moving to local economies, moving to local energy systems, doing the things that we need to do. And I think it's a matter of fighting our struggles in places of power and arresting that power, while we're also building these beautiful emergence of incredible solutions that are already there.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Osprey. And any other questions? So.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. So, when you talked about the worldview, you talked about this longing for a harmonious relationship with the nature that we lost because of industrial revolution and extractivism. But the same industrial revolution also brought economic prosperity and increases in life expectancy, stuff like that. And developing countries, like right now, they also want to share in this prosperity. And there is a dilemma, a very difficult trade-off. So what do you think? What is the approach here? Because simply returning to kind of pre-modern economic practices, this will not be inspiring, I think, to the people in India, in China, in countries like that. So there should be some other solution for them, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think that the issue is that there needs to be an equitable, what we call a just transition. So this requires a big stretch for wealthy countries who have obviously prospered from the extractive industry and colonization. And there needs to be justice for, I really don't like the word developing countries, but just so we put a label on it, or for countries that have not exercised the same kind of development as wealthy countries. And it needs to be equitable. So as an example, when we're advocating at the climate talks for the end of the fossil fuel era, we always say it needs to be funded and fair, because it means that we have to address exactly what you're talking about, which is how do we ensure energy security for countries that have not been prospering in the same way. So this is why I think we have to address these issues collectively, because it's not the same for everyone. It's not even. And this is where the framework of climate justice and the just transition comes in, because you're quite right. You know, why should other countries be suffering endlessly and not have the growth that wealthy countries have, and the conveniences and the health opportunities and all of the things that come with that prosperity? So it's more about, you know, how do we have an equitable transition? And that's what we have to look at. And there's frameworks for this. But we're having to drag wealthy countries to the table to engage. And it's not fair and it's not just. And this is what we're struggling to do.
Yeah, thanks. Actually, if I can just add something before we come to your question, is I do think it's a great question and a great answer. And one thing I would add to that is to recognize that the extreme inequalities, the economic inequalities we have in our world today, create such an imbalance that actually it's not like people often think, well, we need growth in the world because look at all the poor people, and if we grow, then they need to have more material wealth, etc. But the inequalities are so extreme that the economic growth as a whole, actually, virtually all of it just goes to the elites and is not actually helping most of the people. So we're extracting more, we're destroying the environment even more, and not even helping. So we have to look at any transformation in terms of really recognizing how extreme these inequalities are and putting policies in place to actually let that wealth be more like a commonwealth, one that's available to everybody, not just to the small elite. So I just wanted to point that out. And to that question at the back.
Yeah, thank you so much for writing this wonderful book and for your time. My question sort of builds on the two previous questions. I feel like in development studies, it's so often painted as this binary of wealthy nations and underdeveloped, or maybe one could say over-extracted nations. And I find that the reality is often these communities exist throughout settler colonial societies, and rather than focusing on wealthy nations and quote-unquote impoverished nations, how do you feel like you would approach the global majority, knowing that, you know, we have communities in the United States who can't get access to these things that lead to great life expectancy, and it's not this north versus south, but it's actually embedded in settler colonial society by design. And so given that, how do you approach these skewed incentives, and how do you take a seat at the table when the countries that are wealthy aren't incentivized to help the people within their own communities?
Yeah, it's a really great point. I think it's playing off of the same discussion, which is that we do have, this is why I'm talking in the book about the intersection of colonization, racism, patriarchy, and capitalism, because it's really hard to talk about one without the other. And it certainly doesn't have borders around wealthy countries, as you pointed out. So, you know, we see here in the United States, obviously, the fact of racial injustice and colonization of indigenous peoples' lands. We don't have to go outside of a wealthy country to see these same systems of oppression harming people. A lot of our work, is, in different regions of impacted communities here in the United States. And the fact that, when you want to see any kind of, fossil fuel extraction or pipelines, it's mostly happening on the lands of indigenous Black or brown communities out there some way away from, white communities or wealthy communities. So this is why we have to have a systemic approach, because what we're doing is we're really in the the process, hopefully, as collective global movements and the climate justice movement, but also other social and ecological movements, trying to really dismantle these systems, which are really looking at the wealthy elite and looking at how the wealthy elite have, as we've heard in these campaign slogans, the 1%. It really is the 1% that is taking away from most of humanity at this point and collecting more and more power. And so we have to look at how do we dismantle that system and how do we regenerate something else. And as I talk about in the book, it's like there's a chapter on composting, colonization, and capitalism, and like how do we really compost those systems? Because we can't just like poof them away. They're not going to go away tomorrow. So like how do we start getting a handle on them and transforming them and turning them into something else? So yes, these systems of oppression are playing out everywhere all over the world. And they happen in wealthy countries as well as quote unquote poor countries. Even that word poor country I don't like because the people there can be rich in other ways. It's also looking at what we consider to be wealthy, right? So it can also be, looking at GDP as not our only metric of what is important economically, but also very different concepts of wealth and money, like buen vivir or living well or sumak hausai, these different ideas about, what's important, what's valuable is also what we're looking at. So we're not looking at endless economic growth as like the pattern we should all be following through for happiness and joy and well-being on the earth. So it's an intersection of looking at what's actually valuable, what makes us happy, what's a good life for everyone, what is the collective commons. But I do think I would just add to the analysis one more thing, which is even so, we need to realize that there is a power structure, like if we just look at the United States or European countries, that still adds another force, even if within our own countries, there are people suffering, which there are. I think we also still need to recognize countries who have been under the oppression of these wealthy countries and oppressing others for a very long time through the settler colonial project.
Yeah, thank you, Osprey. And any other questions? One final question, if anybody has, or and if not, really, I just want to say, Osprey, thank you so much for your work, for all that you are inspiring so many other people around the world, and for this book, which really enables each of us, all of us, to get connected both in a sort of felt, embodied way and in a kind of deep conceptual way to understand the systemic changes that we need. So really a great gift to us all with this book. Thank you, Osprey.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jeremy.
Let's hear it for Osprey. Thank you.
Thank you so much also, Jeremy, for your work and having this really great conversation. And thank you all for coming. And, I just wanted to close by saying I really would love for people to walk out of here with knowing that we can all do something and that we're connected. I think it's really important to not be alone. It's just too much of a moment in history to feel alone, and to be in community together, and meeting like this is part of it. So thanks so much. And thanks to Green Apple Books for having us. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's keep it going for Osprey.